Cóigán Cóigán Show. It's a pleasure to welcome you all on this fine morning to the National University of Ireland and to this important conference. The Commission for the Economic Development of Rural Areas, ably chaired by Pat Spillane, has an extremely important task at hand. And this conference, bringing together expertise and experts in the area, has a key role to play in the deliberations of the Commission. And to that end, I'd really like to welcome Pat to, I don't know if it's your first visit, Pat, to Maynooth, but I hope we make a wonderful impression on you and that you come back. And also to welcome Geraldine Talon, Secretary General of the Department of the Environment, Community and Local Government. This is a joint initiative of the two ministers, the Minister for Agriculture, Food and Marine and the Minister for Environment, Community and Local Government. And later in the day we'll be inviting, and I should welcome, Minister Phil Hogan TD for his second visit to this campus in just under a year, and I'll come back to why that's the case in a moment. And finally, I'd like to welcome some academic colleagues from Oxfordshire and Queen's University Belfast, and a lot of colleagues from Chagas, an organisation with which we have very close links, and from the Western Development Commission. And I really only have two things that I want to say. The first is the reason for you being here, I infer, and the reason for the Minister being with us twice in such a short period of time, is that there's very considerable expertise in this university, built up over a quarter of a century in detailed analysis at regional and local level of all sorts of social phenomena, and particularly an interest in using that information and that very carefully mapped data to gain new insights into local and regional development, with an emphasis on the urban and the rural in equal measure. And that's due in no small part to the work done by Professor Jim Walsh, who's already been mentioned, and his colleagues over, as I say, a sustained period of time in that domain and building up a team of people around him. You may or may not be aware of this, but university presidents have the sort of inter-presidential rivalry that county managers would have, county GAA managers, I don't know what county managers have. So I have to say I got a text from a colleague in another university about 6 weeks ago saying, I can't open my, insert word, Irish Times any Saturday without one of your maps being in it. So I think you'll be aware of the expertise that is here in this university in mapping, to the point now that a major national newspaper, when it has a spatial question, turns to the unit that Jim set up here in a minute to say, really represent this social or spatial phenomena well for our readers. And the second thing that I want to say is that, to revert to my opening comment, this Commission has an extremely important job. This country has experienced an extraordinary economic shock, one which has disrupted us greatly, but not damaged us fatally. And despite the extraordinary pain that that economic shock has caused the country, it also has been an arresting moment for reflection as a society. And I think we've collectively realised that economic growth and development is both meaningless and dangerous unless it's underpinned by social cohesion and a sense of economic and social sustainability. So thankfully, I think, for us as a country, for those who want to take the opportunity has presented itself to reflect and think about, as we reassemble the shaken elements of our society, what sort of society do we want to rebuild? And in that context, this is a very welcome initiative that two ministers say, as we rebuild our economy and therefore rebuild our society, what specifically and strategically are we going to do to ensure the sustainable development of rural areas? And in that context, it's heartening for me as an academic not to be dismissed as an academic, but that the Commission turns to the academic community and says, what is it you have to tell us? what evidence is there available to us that will guide us in our deliberations, help us in our recommendations, and not for one moment do I think that universities or academics are the fount of all wisdom, but we do have something to offer in terms of evidence and thinking. And it's a real pleasure, and I mean that in an honest sense, it's a real pleasure for us to have the opportunity to participate in that discussion. It's an obligation that we feel very, very strongly, and we're delighted to do so. So I wish you well in what I genuinely believe is a very important day of deliberation. And I offer you the assistance of this university, and by extension all Irish universities, in your thinking, because what you're doing matters, and it's our job to assist as best we can. Gramadich Blair, and I hope you have a very, very productive day.
Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasant duty to get the ball rolling here on the conference this morning, and I would like to add my word of welcome to that of Professor Philip Nolan. Maynooth is a great place, I would have to say, and I'm most appreciative of having the use of such a fine hall on an occasion like this. My department works closely in a number of areas with the university in Maynooth, and we benefit greatly from the research and education here. You're all most welcome to this conference today. Ministers Hogan and Coveney established the Commission last September to provide information necessary to support economic development of rural areas out to 2025. And as Professor Nolan has said, this is a very critical juncture for us. We have suffered a lot over the last 5 to 10 years. But happily, Pat Spillane has said to me in talking beforehand, there hasn't been a single word of negativity in any of the consultations or engagements that he has had so far, and he has had very, very many. So we know the rural community is very focused on its future, very focused on can do rather than what might have been or what the past has done. We're very much looking forward to a time of opportunity. My department is very, very focused on this brief of community and rural development. We work closely with the Department of Agriculture in this area. The research here, as I say, will provide us with evidence and a baseline out to 2025, but it also will provide support for the design of frameworks necessary for the next programming period for rural development funding over the 2014 to 20 period at EU level. And we hope that this process that we have in Cedra, and specifically the conference we're having today, will be a very inclusive process of engagement and consultation in work that is critical and fundamental to the future of rural communities all over Ireland. I'm taking this opportunity as we start to thank Pat Spillane, the Chair of the Commission, because he has dedicated the last few months of his life to taking this area forward. I don't know whether he would want to give up his GAA commentating career for this activity, but I certainly know that he has been absolutely tireless in ensuring that all voices are heard all over rural Ireland. I understand his ability to motivate and mobilise a crowd is absolutely legendary, and that has been critical in getting to the heart of issues in rural Ireland. So we thank you very much, Pat, for taking the chair and dealing with and leading this important initiative. I'd like to thank Conor O'Donoghue of Teagasc and the research team in Cedra, who are very actively involved, as is the Western Development Commission. So I hope you're in for a very productive and a very engaged and a very focused day. And without any further ado, I'll invite Pat Spillane to lead off.
Thanks very much. First of all, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to this, which I believe will be a very informative and hopefully a great learning experience. If there's anything I've taken from the last 6 months, and I take again from today, is that any opportunity we can get all the various stakeholders involved in rural Ireland together in a room, sharing their ideas and opinions, is a good day's work anyway. A little bit of my background, I retired as a principal in St. Goblin's College in Bantry 2 years ago, and I initially decided I was going to enjoy my retirement and do nothing. But it wasn't long, I wasn't long hanging around after a couple of months. Maybe there's so much Judge Judy and Dr. Phil you can watch during the day. But I just realised living in Timpanoe is no different than living in Western Ireland, Northwest Donegal, Southwest Cork. Rural Timpanoe is an area suffering like everywhere else. It's an area suffering from unemployment. It's an area suffering from immigration. It's an area which has no national school. We had 5 national schools in the 1960s. We have no national school. I think we're probably unique in probably being the only GA club in Ireland that for the last 20 years we didn't have a national school in our area. And that was during the Celtic Tiger years. So I just felt I wanted to do something about it. I could hang around and sit down and enjoy my life, but I wanted to put something back. Ireland was good to me. I had 35 great years as a teacher, but I just wanted to do something. I didn't want to sit down and see my area dying in front of me. There was only so many American wakes or Australian wakes you could go to in a week or a fortnight. And I started going to lots of meetings. And the meetings were full of very genuine, very passionate people, very concerned people. But my main problem I used to find with an awful lot of the meetings is that they were mainly dealing with single issues, whether it was the closing of a Garda station, the loss of a teacher, the closing of a community centre. And while they were all very, very, very genuine issues, I used to wake up the following morning, I used to come away from those meetings saying, did anything good come out of that? Did any idea come out of it? Is there a solution? Is there a plan? And there never was a solution, and there never was a plan. And I started to say to myself, we could wallow in self-pity, and we could indulge in the blame game for the rest of our life, but we're not going to get anywhere. And I, along with I know a lot of other like-minded people around Ireland, were pressing for something to be done for rural Ireland. Some plan, some vision, some bit of leadership. And thankfully, Minister Hogan took my concerns on board and he established Cedra, Commission for the Economic Development of Rural Areas, and he asked me to be chairperson. Now, just to clear up one thing, people say, is this another Quango? I can tell you this without fear of contradiction, this isn't a Quango. Someone said it's a sort of yellow pack version of a Quango. It's not even that. I would like to describe Cedra as being the Aldi or Lidl of the Quango world, where we're delivering high quality but at a very cheap price. We don't have an office. We have 6 brilliant interns on a government jobs bridge programme. We have 2 or 3 brilliant individuals from Tagus who combine their day job with working on the Cedra business. Professor Carla Dunn in particular, what he has done in the last 6 months has been unbelievable, and there's myself. So, what is rural Ireland? Where is rural Ireland? As a very simple definition, rural Ireland for us in Cedra is everywhere outside the 5 major cities, Dublin, Cork, Waterford, Limerick and Galway. That's rural Ireland. And our brief was very simple. Not looking in the past, not indulging in the blame game. Our brief, when we got the job in November, was to come up with a job strategy for rural Ireland. A job strategy that can drive economic development, that can support existing employment, but in particular that can create jobs at a local level. And people will say, well, why rural Ireland? Why not all of Ireland? I think the statistics speak for itself. Since the recession, unemployment in urban areas has risen by 114%. Since the recession, unemployment in rural areas has risen by 192% and far more in other areas. And of course the main reason for that is that people in rural Ireland were dependent on sectors that were most affected by the economic downturn, and we talk in particular about the construction industry. So what is the aim of Cedra? What is Cedra all about? What has it been all about? Cedra is based on extensive public consultation. Cedra was about listening, gathering information, collecting information about the future economic potential of Ireland and how best to channel funding over the next 12-13 years. Now people will say, and quite rightly so, is this another Quango? Will we produce another file that will end up gathering dust in some government department? I firmly believe it won't. I firmly believe Cedra is going to be different. Cedra will achieve. And you know why it will achieve and why it is different? Number one, the first key component of Cedra. Too much policy in this country is created at central level, and it doesn't take into account the issues of the people on the ground. And the issues and concerns of rural Ireland are very unique to rural Ireland. So number one, what Cedra has been all about is about consulting the people on the ground who have the answers, the people living and working in rural Ireland. That's number one. But the second key objective, and I think it's the most important aspect of Cedra's work and why to deliver, it's about, Cedra was all about, like I said, it's gathering and consulting. But more especially, it was about bringing all the stakeholders together. Whether it is the business people, whether it is the voluntary groups, whether it is the social enterprises, whether it was the agencies. It was about bringing all those groups together and coming up with a bit of joined up thinking and producing a coordinated plan. I don't know how many times throughout the country in the last 6 months that we sat down with a group of stakeholders, whether it was in the area of maybe tourism or renewables or fishing. Do you know what was the one thing that you used to always say? This is the first time we ever, as a group, sat around the table together. They knew each other, but they were all operating in different parallel universes in many cases. So Cedra is about bringing all the stakeholders together. Cedra is about joined up thinking, and Cedra is about coming up with a coordinated plan. Now, how was this consultation? How was this information gathered? There were several aspects to our consultation. We held public hall meetings. We held village hall meetings. We held stakeholder meetings, like I said, where we brought the stakeholders together, the agencies, the business people, the manufacturers, the voluntary groups, the social enterprises. We had a website up and running, ruralireland.ie, and parallel with that, we've been doing research so that we can provide an evidence base on which to develop those recommendations. And on top of all that, one of the other things I did, which I found very interesting and very informative, that we started to brainstorm the key entrepreneurs and business people around Ireland. And we had absolutely fantastic and very informative 2-3 hour meetings with guys who've been there, done that in rural Ireland. So I met fellas, Pat McDonald, Supermax, Brian McCarthy, Fexco, Kiloglan, founder of Fexco, Kiloglan, Edmund Harty, entrepreneur of the year in Ireland last year, Dairy Master and Causeway, Dennis Brosnan, Kelly Group. We brainstormed those fellas for 2 or 3 hours. I'd say I learned more in those 3 hours about rural Ireland and how best to get jobs going in rural Ireland than I would, I'd say, for the rest of my life. Brilliant people. It wasn't anything complicated, it was common sense, but it was very, very informative and very, very enlightening. The idea from all those consultations is that all these consultations, from the general public, from the stakeholder meetings, from expert focus groups, etc., all of these submissions are going to feed directly into our final report. So the report is not about me or our commission members coming up with a draft. It's about analysing and assessing all the information that we've gathered from the general public and the general public submissions feeding directly into that jobs plan. That's what Cedra is all about. We only asked 3 questions at the meetings. At every meeting, whether it was with the entrepreneur, the stakeholder, or the public meetings, the 3 questions we asked were very simple. What are the opportunities for job creation in rural Ireland? Number 2, how best can those job opportunities be realised? And number 3, what are the barriers to job opportunities? I learned from mistakes. The first meeting I started with barriers, and by Christ could people recite off by heart and they come up with 1 million barriers. And you found that after an hour and a half of people complaining about the barriers and challenges, you could see any bit of optimism left had drained from their body. So in the end we started with opportunities. And you know what? There was many a meeting after 3 hours, that we hadn't even reached the challenges or the obstacles. There was that many opportunities out there, and there was that many ideas that were being given to us. Our job strategy is focused on 3 areas. It's focused on rural resources, whether it was agri-food, whether it was tourism, whether it was marine, whether it was forestry, whether it was the renewables. That's the first plank of our job strategy, working on rural resources. The second plank on our job strategy is about rural services. What are the drivers of domestic demand? What are the particular issues that are affecting small towns and villages around rural Ireland? And what challenges are the small and medium industries facing in surviving or trying to start up? And the third plank was looking at the export sector, looking at export jobs for rural Ireland, or looking at foreign direct investment. Also, while they were the three planks of our job strategy, we also examined the institutional supports for job creation that are out there. What are the institutional supports that are currently exist? What are their impacts on job creation? What do people out there in rural Ireland feel about the effectiveness of these institutional supports? And we've also examined international models of institutional support and how best they can be used in Ireland. Just some of the statistics from our 5-6 months. We had 9 public meetings where there was almost 500 people at it. In general, between stakeholder meetings and public meetings, we had over 1,000 people. We got 200 submissions via email and post. Overall, we got another 850 contributions have been given to Cedra. We've been in 23 of the 26 counties, and before we're finished, we'll have the other 3 covered. And I apologise if we couldn't get around to everywhere to do a public meeting. But like I said, this wasn't exactly one man in the job operation, but it wasn't far away from it either. So we just simply, it was a tough job for the couple of people who were on it. And I apologise. We would love to bat around to if we had time, if we had resources, we'd love to bat around to hearing everything. What we did find though, that in general, it was the common themes, it was recurring themes coming up from the public meetings and coming up from the stakeholder meetings. Now, more or less, the submissions are coming to a close. The public meetings are more or less finished. The stakeholder meetings. But now, it's only from now on that our real work starts. And what we're doing now, in the process from now on, is we're getting experts to compose briefing documents on every particular area. Whether it is on renewables, whether it is on artisan food, whether it is on tourism, whether it is on marine. So we're getting briefing documents. Then that briefing document is being brought to an expert focus group. We'll have 21 expert focus group meetings over the next 2 months, varying from, like I said, from renewables to agri-food to whatever. And after that then, with the expert focus group, the briefing document is coming in, the submissions from the general public is coming in, and we're coming up then with a first draft, which will go to the Commission, go back again, and a final draft. Just without going into specifics and tell you what are the ideas that are out there, the one thing I can say, tell you today, is just to give you an idea of what are the recurring themes. And like I said, when you literally have been to one public meeting, you were nearly at them all in the sense that there was the recurring themes at all the meetings, whether it was the stakeholders, whether it was the public meetings. And what are they? In no particular order, I will just list some of them. That rural policy must be kept in line with changing rural circumstances. That the interests of rural communities must be properly represented. That's a key point, because it's the one thing I'm discovering all along, is that the interests of rural communities aren't really being properly interested. Yes, there's millions of different groups doing brilliant jobs, but I'm not too sure is everyone working together. We need to work together. And I look at the one recurring theme that's coming on, that the key to success in rural areas will come from bottom-up development, not top-down. What are the other recurring themes? That there's a part of rural Ireland in every single government department in this country. Well, it's not the responsibility of anyone. That is a major challenge. No one has taken control. No one has responsibility for rural Ireland. There's lots of policy out there, perhaps not enough vision. In many cases, and it's a familiar theme we're getting, in many cases it's East Coast solutions for West Coast problems. But the one thing we're finding out there, and Geraldine referred to it, there's great people out there in rural Ireland, full of great ideas, full of brilliant ideas, but they need support and they need encouragement. And that was one thing I was saying to Geraldine, in all the public meetings, in all the stakeholder meetings, but particularly the public meetings. It must have been a record for public meetings in Ireland over the last 6 months that there was no criticism, there was no negativity, there was no whinging. Because, do you know what, it's an old saying, where focus goes, energy flows. Our focus in those public meetings was, lads, come up with ideas for job creation. And for 3.5, 4 hours, they were doing that. And I remember a fellow in Scariff in County Clare saying one night, you know, he said, isn't this brilliant? He said, there was 120 people on a wet night in a village hall in Scariff, sitting down around tables, trying to come up with ideas for rural Ireland, trying to get that area going. And you know, he made the point to me, he said, you know, he says, Clare has been mentioned twice in the last 12 months in the media. Once for itinerants fighting in Innis, and the other for the fellas sleeping rough in the toilets in Innis, he says. He says, isn't this one of the problems in rural Ireland? And maybe it's a media issue. There's no good news stories out there about. Our national media ignore all the good news stories about rural Ireland. It's all about negativity. It's all about cutbacks. It's all about slash and burn. Our national media aren't portraying the rural Ireland that really is out there, full of vibrant communities, full of great people, full of great ideas, full of people but who need encouragement. We need a reallocation of the enterprise budget to rural development. Social inequity must be taken into account. There need to be different rural needs for different areas. One side doesn't fit all. But you know, out of those general things, I think the one thing I see, that we need a lead government department. We need a lead government department. And one of the most interesting meetings I had over the last couple of weeks, last Wednesday, we decided to hold a meeting in Leinster House, just to tell them about the work with Cedra. 50 TDs and senators turned up to the meeting. And once the door was closed, it became the most amazing meeting that I listened to. Because once there was no media there, once there was no journalists there, all you had was 50 TDs and senators who were really passionate about rural Ireland, whose contributions were really insightful, brilliant contributions, but you didn't know what party they were even representing. There were people who were really, really, really concerned and passionate about rural Ireland. And if there's anything comes out of that meeting, I know they want us back again and we're going back, but we need some sort of cross-party committee in Leinster House to lead and to drive changes for rural Ireland. If I come up, and there's one other thing I have written down, it's in big blue that comes up all the time, about the frustration faced, that there's a need for some form of one-stop shop. When I look at challenges, the challenges were fairly general and fairly straightforward. There was the problems about infrastructure. There was obviously the challenges about the lack of broadband. There was obviously the challenge about the migration of youth and the migration of skills. But if I had to put a top 3 of challenges that I see that are facing job creation, I would put them in order of this. Number 3, the third biggest challenge was finance. Access to finance and trying to set up jobs. That was number 3. Number 2, the second biggest challenge by a million miles, was red tape and bureaucracy. I could write a book, lads, ladies and gentlemen, I could write a book of all the stories that I've heard about challenges, bureaucracy and red tape. And you wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry. They were so frustrating, they were so hilarious at times, and they were so ridiculous. So, we certainly, if there is a challenge there, let's get rid of the red tape and bureaucracy. And I found that the biggest challenge of the whole lot that was coming across was the agencies. There's a million agencies out there, and I'm not in any way criticising any of them. Everyone brilliant in their own way, some better than others. But the one message we were getting through all the time about a lot of these agencies was that no one was working together. In too many cases, agencies were working in parallel universes. And like I said, the amount of times we sat at a meeting and people saying, this is our first time sitting together. That shouldn't be the case. And finally, you know, what do we really need for rural Ireland? I think we need a complete sea change in opinion. And I mean by a sea change in opinion, a sea change in opinion amongst government, government departments and agencies. We must look on the job of job creation and economic development. It should be everyone's job in the public sector. Agencies must no longer be blockers. Agencies must provide solutions. Agencies must provide practical steps to job creation. We need to find solutions. We need to take the hassle away from setting up business. We need to reduce the risk. Our jobs plan, I'd love to say after 6 months, or when we give it on the Minister's desk in the end of September, that it's going to be a magic wand. It's not. There's no silver bullet out there for job creation in rural Ireland. The key to rural development will be in a series of small steps. But I remember we getting great advice from one particular government official, department official one day. I said, look, have we a chance with a job strategy? What do we need to do to get a job strategy adopted by government and taken on board and run with it? And his advice from that first meeting, I've held on to, and it's what our plan will be all about. He said, if your job strategy can tick 3 boxes, then it can work. If it can be solid, if it can be practical, and if it can be workable. I can rest assured, our job strategy won't have 600 pages, 400 pages, 500 pages. It won't be aspirational, and it won't be like some other job strategies in the past, cut and paste. It'll be solid, practical, workable, short, concise, and to the point. And it will achieve. And you know what? If anything can be achieved out of Cedra, if anything can be achieved about meetings such as this, about getting like-minded people concerned about rural land together, if one thing we want to get, and what we want is we want to get the economic development of rural Ireland back on the political agenda again. And if we can do that, Jesus, we've started. Thank you very, very much for coming here. Like I said, I'm not speaking anymore. This is about listening to your contributions, and hopefully that a lot of your contributions and submissions today will help formulating our job strategy, because we want this job strategy to work. We're not at the last chance saloon in rural Ireland, but by Christ, we're getting damn close to it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Into the start of our proceedings with passion like that. Pat, it's easy to see why in our department and with our ministers we should be very excited and enthused about this work. It is extremely valuable work from department's point of view, but most particularly it is clearly extremely important work for the future of rural Ireland. So I'll move straight on now because we have 2 expert presentations. We won't pause for questions at the end of the individual presentations. We'll hear the 2 and then we have a facilitated discussion afterwards. Our first speaker this morning is Professor Janet Dwyer, Professor of Rural Policy and co-director of the Countryside Community Research Institute in the UK, where she directs and undertakes research related to agriculture, the environment and rural development. So Janet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, and thank you very much to Cal and to all those that were involved in inviting me to this great opportunity to touch base with what's going on in rural Ireland at the moment and to hear a lot of information and a lot of, I'm sure, very good and interesting ideas about the way forward. So I'm not an expert on rural Ireland. I do a lot of work at the European level, and I've worked in a lot of other countries, and I have done a bit of work in Ireland, but I didn't claim to know anything like as much as many of the other speakers on today's platform. But listening to practice now, it makes one realise how much common ground we share across Europe as we strive to create a viable pathway for sustainable rural development. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavour of my feeling of where things are in Europe at the moment, and see if we can use that to kind of reflect back on the Irish situation and help to stimulate perhaps some more discussion in the day. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the European perspective on the challenges that lie ahead. Now, many of you will no doubt have read the documents that have come out of Brussels, Horizon 2020, and the other sectoral and focus strategies that follow from that. But just a taster, really, of main challenges. Then, I think it's a good time to take stock of what rural development programmes have achieved. We're just coming to the end of the second programming period. A lot of money has been spent, a lot of challenges have been targeted, and I've been involved in some of the evaluations, so I'm sort of beginning to start to say, well, what have we done and what could we still do a lot better? And then focusing particularly on the next programme and the next decade, addressing challenges and trying to support innovation and change, picking up some of the themes that Pat mentioned. So the challenges at the European level are significant, and particularly for rural areas because of the way that more and more resources are going to be demanded from rural areas in the years ahead. It's not just about food, it's not just about rural communities, it's about all the services and all the resources that the whole of society will increasingly need to look to rural areas to provide. So we have the challenge of increasing fossil fuel prices and more scarcity in that area. We have significant estimates of growing global food demand in the next 30 or 40 years as developing countries' populations increase and their buying power and their tastes in particular for different types of food change. We have, of course, the major challenge of climate change, which imposes pressures not just on the southern countries because of water scarcity, but as Ireland will be very aware, it brings changes in respect of water and flooding and increasing uncertainty in the management of rural land in the north. We have challenges from demographic change. We have the ageing of the European population as a whole, but a lot of migration within that, which I'm sure Ireland is also very aware of. And we have this medium-term prospect of no easing up in the public finances. So a continuing climate of austerity within which we have to face the outworkings of these challenges. This was a slide that I borrowed from Martin Shaler, who works in DG Agri of the European Commission, which just tries to put some of those changes together in a series of pictures, which I think is quite a nice montage. The implications for rural activities and resources. Pat mentioned that one of their main themes is rural resource use. And I think the main challenge for Europe is becoming more efficient in rural resources because there will be so many different demands placed on rural areas. And if we look at what we've done in the past, too much has been wasteful, and there's a lot of scope to reduce that waste and to reuse waste and to turn things that were once seen as a problem into an opportunity going forwards. The multifunctionality of rural spaces has to be maintained and increased. This isn't just about focusing on food security and food production. It's about accommodating food security and food production alongside the need to use land for energy, the need to use land for social and recreational purposes. Those things won't go away. It's just that the pressures, in a sense, are growing. And as we understand more about the interrelationship between these different resources and what's being termed ecosystem services, all the different things that the rural environment and rural communities provide for the rest of society, the more we realise that we need to understand how they interrelate if we're going to manage them effectively. So we need to focus on places, on the specific interactions of those resources in each part of each country to understand best how to manage that challenge. If we look in particular at rural communities, and I think Ireland, as we've heard from Pat, has specific and serious challenges in this respect, there are still a lot of issues facing rural areas as we move ahead, and a particular challenge in that it can't always be looking to public funding to solve those challenges. They include changes in people, they include changes in services, and probably a withdrawal of some degree of public service because of the financial climate. But at the same time, technology has changed and people's opportunities to learn and to communicate has changed. And if we can get the rural broadband issues sorted, we can have increasing scope for making use of that opportunity for greater communication and greater learning from one another. So if we were to look at the two key challenges in respect of rural development programmes, there's a challenge still for agriculture, and it's this term which has been coined by scientists in the UK, sustainable intensification. But that's about trying to meet these rural resource demands in a durable way, in a way which doesn't destroy the resource base and which supports and sustains rural communities and rural environment. And enabling resilience, this ability to adapt, to cope with unforeseen circumstances in the future, through maintaining diversity, through not putting too many eggs into one basket. And that, I think, is something that we need to keep our eye on, because the market always has a tendency to push you towards specialisation, and that's a danger if we're not too careful. If we're looking at what rural development programmes across Europe have achieved since 2000, I've been involved variously in ex-post evaluations of the previous programme, in mid-term evaluations of the current programme at individual country levels and at European level. And I've done some work for the European Parliament, particularly looking at the current CAP reform proposals and thinking about sustainable competitiveness and innovation and the challenges for small and semi-subsistence farming. And I've been involved in the European Network for Rural Development, looking in particular at the way in which design and delivery of programmes affects how well they perform. A little bit in line with those comments that Pat made about red tape and bureaucracy, trying to understand how these things get in the way of achieving outcomes. Overall, in the programmes, the biggest spenders have been environmental management, and particularly the less favoured area aids, and also support for competitiveness, the Axis 1, farm investments and adding value. Much less money from the agriculture budget has gone on rural economy, but of course one has to put that in the context of other European funding and European regional and social funds targeting, to some extent, rural economic development as well. Those are really just some summary comments on what the picture at the European level appears to show at present. So some good things, but some not so good things, and in particular a realisation of the limitations of trying to do everything with one particular instrument and the need to work much more in coordination with others to sustain the benefits. If we take stock of the lessons that we might have learned, there are certain patterns that emerge. In Northwest Europe, the bulk of rural development programme funding is going into Axis 2, into environmental management and the support of marginal areas. I think it's difficult to say that that's achieving a complete turnaround of the viability of these areas. Problems of decline and issues of environmental quality persist, and I think it makes one aware of the way in which larger and stronger forces often undermine the achievements of those particular payments. That's not to say they're not important. I think they're very important, but I think we need to be more realistic about what else needs to happen to make them deliver best value. A lot of money has gone into farm modernisation, classic farm investment, particularly in the new member states. But on its own, there's a lot of criticism about what that has or hasn't achieved, sometimes feeling that money is going to people that maybe don't need the money most because of the way in which the delivery system is favouring larger, more able, more active and more risk-confident investors, and perhaps not addressing the areas of real need and also areas of important opportunity. There's been a learning process in respect of how you put together a variety of different measures into packages to achieve the most at the local level. Because nobody's business development idea neatly fits into one particular measure box. You quite often need a combination of measures to achieve a real change on the ground. And that in itself can be an administrative headache, which we need to work on making more simple. And the other thing I think which we haven't yet managed to do very well with Pillar 2 programmes is to bridge this divide between agriculture and the wider rural economy. And yet if you think of the challenges that I was talking about at the beginning of my presentation, that's absolutely essential when we go forward, because farmers are going to be managing rural resources for all these different demands, and simply to treat them as agricultural producers is insufficient. We need to cross that divide more effectively in future. In respect of agriculture, I think there's still a big challenge in achieving more sustainable agriculture, and for that I mean not only the environmental but also the social context of agriculture and obviously its economic viability. And those things have to go together, and too often I think one is sacrificed at the expense of the others. So you maybe pursue environmental gains and then your communities go to pieces because you're extensifying, getting rid of labour, so forth. You pursue economic gains by a lot of capital investment and then you put pressure on the environment, and so on. And I think this is something which remains an important challenge going forward. I don't need to say the second point in Ireland, but policymakers in Brussels sometimes perhaps don't think about it often enough. There's still a lot of vulnerability in rural change to much bigger influences and policies. So that's global market trends and policies which haven't a particular focus on the rural have a very big impact on what happens there. My third point about the delivery challenge is one that I particularly feel, having worked for the last couple of years in Malta. The whole process of designing these complicated multi-measure programs and delivering them through a myriad of agencies may create a kind of a muddle of bureaucracy in the West, but in the East, in the new member states, it is really a nightmare. And many of the countries that joined the European Union in 2004 have had significant problems simply spending money because it's become too complicated and such a challenge. And what one then finds is a rush to spend money towards the end of programmes in ways which don't look strategic and don't deliver much by way of change or transformation. So I think the delivery challenge is something that every member state and every programme needs to focus on more in future. How to make things solid, simple, accessible, as Pat was saying. The Commission is very focused for the next programme period on innovation, and I think that's the correct focus, because I think that those sorts of challenges that I was talking about do need a bit of a step change in practice. But it's not just about new technology, it's not just about science, it's about much better working together. It's about breaking down those institutional barriers that Pat was talking about earlier. And it's about being smarter about how to get policies to help with change on the ground and learning from the people on the ground. It's never possible in policy terms to simply force people to innovate. Innovation has to be a kind of self-generated thing. But I think the energy and the ideas for innovation are out there. It's about fostering the right climate to help bring them forward. And the evidence from good examples around Europe is very much that these sorts of ingredients are important. Bringing together research and practice. So farmers working very closely with, say, soil scientists, or people producing certain types of products to work very much with people who have more expertise in marketing, more expertise in product development or branding, to bring together the different types of expertise to generate new ideas and think about new ways of solving problems. Networks and collaborative action are very important in that context. So it's not just about agencies working together, it's about people on the ground working together, it's about bringing together people with different knowledge that haven't necessarily had the opportunity to get together in the past. And I think, again, this idea of working within landscapes, within local areas, trying to pool experience and source new ideas is very valuable. These might be some of the key goals of innovative approaches in, I say, space and place. Space meaning kind of the land, territory, place meaning the places where people live that matter to them. There's transformation needed in the management of the land, in farm level knowledge. There's a lot more that can be done to rethink some of our conventional ideas about how to manage land and how to make a good business. There's obviously remaining challenges in respect of environmental performance on farms. I was reading yesterday about phosphate issues in Ireland and the whole challenge of effective use of the Nitrates Directive in a way which doesn't simply shut down a lot of businesses but helps them to cope. It's very important. We need to cope with continued public funding restraint. That's not just a challenge for Ireland, it's a challenge for most of Europe's member states going forward. And I think, again, echoing something that Pat said, learning from the experience of successful pioneers is extremely valuable. And there are people here, and there are people in many other rural parts of Europe who have successes, who have very good ideas, who are very forward-thinking in ways which the state hasn't yet really recognised. And if we can learn from them, I think we can improve our policies. These are just some pictures of initiatives that I've come across in my travels. Most of these ones are actually from the UK, but learning about soil science, on the left-hand side, a scientist and a farmer doing a soil profile, workshops and events where people get together and walk around areas discussing techniques and how best to address different challenges, initiatives for healthy livestock, initiatives for spatial planning, initiatives bringing together communities and farmers to develop new strategies for their areas. On the rural communities side, there's been a lot of forward thinking, really trying to think about what is our rural community going to need to look like in 50 or 100 years' time, and planning on that basis. Some examples here from England, but also some very good, I think, action in rural Ireland. And again, bringing in this whole use of tools from the internet and the revolution in digital data to enrich that process. Okay, towards the end now. If we look at the draft regulation for rural development programmes for the next time around, I think there's a lot of very positive developments. The framework that's being put forward has a much greater emphasis on learning, on cooperation and on innovation. And those things I think should be helpful in dealing with the challenges that Europe faces. There's also a strong move towards better coordination with other EU funds, but at the moment I fear that's getting rather mired in a kind of bureaucratic process. Whether it actually delivers at the end of the day is still unclear. But I think what the whole framework should provide is a lot of scope for imaginative responses at the local level. The challenge is whether governments, managing authorities, departments and agencies will really be able to take up that imaginative response and think about doing things differently. Because there's always a tendency at the end of each programme to say, oh, we'll just roll everything forward. And I don't think that that's sufficient. And I hope that this process that Cedra is going through is going to mean that there will be a bit of a shake-up in some respects going forward for Ireland. You have some very good experience, but you also could do more, as we all could. So providing a good toolkit in Brussels isn't enough for making things work. You need more skilled mechanics, more people who are operating policies to understand all these issues of the need to bring different actors together, of making things simpler and more accessible, and learning from the best practice and the best examples. And the other worry that I have at this particular point in time is that when the heat rises in the discussion rooms in Brussels, rural development programmes tend to lose out in the budget struggles because they're more ambitious, because they involve doing risky things. You know, a single farm payment is a lot easier to disperse than a project for anaerobic digestion cooperatives, for example, which I know Ireland has been working with. And that's always a risk then, at the last moment when things are getting difficult, that these things will get undermined. And I think it's beholden on all of those of us who work with rural development to try and ensure that doesn't happen. I hesitate with this one. I just had these ideas this morning because I felt my talk was too general and I wanted to focus a little bit on what Ireland might look like from the outside when you dip in and out, as I have done. The Irish RDP has spent a lot of money on agri-environment, and the REPS programme is, in many respects, an exemplar across Europe for what it has achieved. But I think I'm very aware of the limitations of a payment scheme per hectare for delivering environmental sustainability. It's not enough on its own, and it never will be enough. And there's a need, really, to build the bridges between that kind of land-based approach and approaches which are about viable and sustainable business. And I've certainly done some work in the UK which suggests that if all you do is think that you can deliver the environment through agri-environment schemes, you may actually completely fail in your objectives, because business goes on, markets go on, trends go on, and everything changes in ways which actually might undermine your basic goals. So I think we need to do a lot more to think about sustainable green and land-based businesses in Ireland going forward. Looking at farm change in the last decade, I gather the dairy sector has shrunk and the beef sector is now becoming the dominant product, if you like, that Irish agriculture is focused on. And I think that diversity is a strength going forwards. I know the markets push you towards the best options in short-term economic sense. Ireland is a very richly endowed rural country, and I think there is scope for more than just cattle systems, and I think that a lot of interesting things could be done at the local level on that front. I'm sure they're going on. You probably know many more than I could even suggest. And the other thing, it seems to me, is that we need to move beyond the farm gate. We need to be more clever in designing strategic approaches to funding, which bring together the primary producer with all the people in the food chain, all the people in the tourism chain, all the people in the leisure chain, all the people in the energy chain, because if any of these things is going to work, it's about coordinating action up and down those chains. And then my final slide is really about coming back to this issue of bureaucracy and red tape and trying to learn from the experience that there has been of more than 10 years of trying to do rural development effectively through the second pillar. We have to get much better at working with multiple goals. On the ground, any business is facing multiple opportunities and multiple constraints. You can't just focus on one thing, you have to keep an eye on everything. And I think that our agencies and our departmental structures are all too often obstacles to doing that. And we need to be better at working together and working with real-world, complex situations. That means combining resources, whether it be funding or knowledge or experience. And it means policymakers working much more closely with stakeholders in policy design and in delivery, which is often the kind of Achilles heel that lets good ideas down. We need to reduce the weight of controls and bureaucracy. We saw this certainly this programming period with the experience of leader groups. Bureaucracy can really just stifle so many good ideas in action if you can't minimise the weight of both the paperwork and the audit. It's not so essential that every step in every process has to follow the way that somebody in Brussels has decided that it ought to be. What's important is that it delivers the results that Brussels is seeking in putting funding into different programmes. We need to get better at that whole culture of control. And we need to be good as policymakers in incentivising experiments. And experiments are risky things and experiments might fail. And that has to be recognised. Too often when I travel around different countries in Europe, but particularly the new member states, they are so risk averse. It's almost amazing that anybody manages to innovate at all, because so many controls and so many checks and balances are there to try and ensure that money doesn't get wasted or abused. I mean, obviously, money shouldn't be abused, but if you constrain too much, then nobody can move. An issue about targeting. There's a lot of talk about if public money is constrained, you have to target. But targeting means all kinds of different things to different people, and I just wanted to say that from my perspective, targeting is very important, but it should be about working with the people on the ground to target, not about making decisions in the centre about what we will and what we won't fund. Because it's only when you get down to the ground level and you see the challenges in each local area that you really understand what the targets should be. So targeting should not mean about putting constraints in at high levels, and it shouldn't thereby lead to big costs on both sides. It's about understanding and communication. So those are just a few points and ideas from a wider perspective. I hope they might provide some stimulus to today's discussions, and I'm really interested to hear what follows. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Janet. Very much on button in time terms, and a very comprehensive presentation. A lot of messages for a department that covers both environment and community. It was very, very interesting talk from the perspective of rural development. We now move to Dr. David Meredith, Senior Research Officer in Teagasc and Head of Research for Cedra, to speak to us on Rural Ireland 1986 to 2011, key drivers for change.
Thank you very much for that. Well, first and foremost, thank you all for coming today. I'm going to look at this issue of rural economic change over quite a long period of time. The normal approach to looking at change is to take something relatively short and talk about what's changed in that interval. What I'm doing here is going back to effectively the mid-1980s and using each census of population to trace through changes that have taken place over 25 years. And the purpose here is to try and kind of get away from looking at some of the absolutely shocking consequences of the economic downturn, and I will comment on some of that, but to look at the broader trends that are shaping rural areas in Ireland. And these trends are long run, they're ongoing, and they have remained largely unaltered for a very long period of time. And if we don't identify them and deal with them appropriately, well then there's very little chance of actually instigating real and sustainable rural development. So, in terms of going through the presentation today, I'm really going to talk about Ireland's change in economic geography, then looking at some of the processes and drivers of change that underpin these changes, and then highlighting a number of issues and potential questions or issues that might be discussed afterwards. I don't really come to any conclusions because I think it's today is all about getting your views on what you think about what you're hearing today, and I'm perfectly willing to accept that other people have very different views and interpretations of what I'm going to present. Before really kicking off here and getting into the geography of economic change, I'm just going to set a context, because much of the economic change that I'm going to talk about relates to fundamental social changes that have taken place in Ireland over a long period of time. And this graph is just really an introduction to what has changed in Ireland. And I've broken it out into urban and rural areas. And what we can see is that from the mid-1980s onwards, we had growth in employment in both urban and rural areas between 1986 up to 2006, and declining since. Rural areas tended to grow at a slower pace than urban areas, but have also witnessed a lower level of decline overall. And so that's what the figures at the top of the graph tell us. But there's the 4.6% decline in the numbers of people employed in rural areas compared to 7.7% decline in urban areas. And this indicates that rural areas are responding differently to the crisis. And they're responding differently for a number of reasons, and I'll get into that shortly. Before I do, there is an instinctive thing that a lot of people do when they start talking about rural areas. and particularly in relation to economic development, and that's to say, well, what is the rural economy? And what this pie chart tells us is that really the rural economy is not divorced from the urban economy. About 55% of all jobs are located in urban areas, okay, and they're filled by people who live and work in urban areas. Another 18% of jobs are filled by people who live in rural areas but commute to urban areas. So again, there's 18%. That 18% can be added to the 55%, and that's the total number of jobs that are located in urban areas in Ireland. 6% of people who live in an urban area commute to a rural area to work. And 21% of people who live in rural areas also work in rural areas. So it's about 27% of all jobs in Ireland are located in rural areas. And that's fine. I mean, if you want to just talk about that proportion of the economy, you can do that. But it doesn't really make sense, because what we're really doing here is dealing with individual households. And one person in a household might live and work in a rural area, but that other person might go and work in an urban area. So it's impossible to disentangle urban and rural. And you get yourself in knots if you try and do this sort of thing. And it really is meaningless at the end of the day. So the data in the pie chart tell us that there are very intensive and very solid linkages between urban and rural areas in Ireland. And if we want to understand the economic development of rural areas, we need to understand these linkages and what's happening and why. And I'll pick up on some of that. The map there is it's really for information purposes more than anything else. It shows the location. Each dot represents where there is at least 10 jobs. Okay, so it shows the distribution of, in the Irish context, medium to large size employment opportunities around the country. And unsurprisingly enough, around the main cities, there are very large concentrations of these places. But then really through much of the country, we find them as well. There are pockets here and there where there is relatively small numbers of these locations. But it gives an idea of kind of the distribution of employment opportunities at that level in terms of 10 plus jobs. I said at the outset that although I'm talking about economic change, I'm actually really talking about social change. And one of the biggest social changes that we've seen taking place in Ireland since the mid-1980s is the increasing number of women in the workforce. And I know that very coincidentally, the Irish Times began doing a series over the weekend of the role of women in workplaces and how that has changed over time. And this graph captures some of that change. In terms of in 1986, there was about 352,000 women in work in Ireland. By 2011, it was 855,000. The number of males in work had increased from 743,000 in 1986 up to 956,000. Now that's a decline of 14% from 2006, when the male workforce stood at 1.1 million. As you can see from this graph, the female workforce has continued to increase throughout the period of the recession. Now, albeit at a much slower rate than before. This particular development has a very specific sectoral composition in terms of where do women work. So, in effect, you might ask, well, why has this happened? And it's because certain sectors of the economy have grown much faster than others, and within those sectors, certain types of jobs have grown much faster than others, and those types of jobs tend to be filled by women. Okay, so within academic discussion, we talk about segmented labour markets, and we can talk about gendered labour markets, so they're gendered as a male and female. And when we think about sectors like the health sector or teaching, many people automatically begin to assume, oh yeah, teachers, female, nurses, female, doctors, male. Not true anymore, but there is that instinctive characterization of certain types of jobs being gendered. And that process results from the sorting, what we call the sorting of the labour market. And that sorting of the labour market tends to occur, well, at the very beginning in the high chair. Okay? It starts very, very early in life in terms of people setting goals for their children. And as a consequence, what we see in terms of male employment, there's a concentration in a number of sectors. This has changed over time, as you'd expect, and we can see some of the impacts of the recession here in terms of the bottom three categories relate to agriculture, forestry, fishing, construction and manufacturing related industries. All of those, well, agriculture has seen something of an increase in recent years, about 2,000 additional people working in the sector since 2006. But when you look at the long run trend back from 1986 up to the present, all of those sectors have shed employment. So too has the commerce sector in terms of males. The transport and communication sector is increasing in terms of employment for males, as is professional services. But you can see that trend of increasing up to 2006 and then declining. The contrast is with women, and what we see is, although there are fewer women working in certain sectors, particularly manufacturing related industries, there's been substantial growth in commerce over the period, a reduction in most between 2006 and 2011, but very substantial growth in professional services. Now, just to be clear, most of professional services is the health, education and social work sectors in Ireland. Okay? Now, what does this look like? From a geographic point of view, what I did is I identified the sector in which the largest number of people were employed, okay, and classified each ED in the country accordingly. So if an ED had maybe 10 people living in it, and 6 of them worked in agriculture, then it's coloured green on this map, okay? 4 of them could have been working in, transport and communications, but that's ignored. So this is a very simplified version of reality. But it provides a very useful summary measure of the changing geography of industrial employment in Ireland. And I've separated out men and women because, as you've already seen, they follow very distinctly different trajectories in terms of their development. And also because, relatively speaking, there was a very low number of women employed in Ireland back in 1986. And the map that you're seeing here, and I'm going to flip through these very quickly, okay? It's just to give you an impression of change, and I want to talk about those drivers of change. The map that you see here is fairly intuitive. When speaking about it, I've said that, this is the sort of thing that when I was sitting my leaving cert, this is what we were talking about. That in urban centres you had a lot of commerce-related activities. So that's these kind of bluey pale colours. You can kind of see them in around Cork, Limerick, Dublin, a little bit in Galway as well, and other pockets around the country as well. Then outside of that, you've got these pinky colours, which is professional services, and that would automatically relate back to very large employment associated with very large institutions like universities, large hospitals, and so on. And then the brownish areas relate to manufacturing dominated areas. Okay? And then green represents agriculture. So, as I said, it's kind of intuitive. Around the cities and towns we see secondary and tertiary sectors, and outside those in rural areas we see predominantly agriculture, but also some manufacturing as well. But as we go through time, so this is 1981, 2000, 2006, 2011, there's huge changes that have taken place in Ireland. Okay? And I went through that very quickly, but in summary, what we see is that overall the numbers of people employed in agriculture in particular has declined. Okay? So too have the numbers of people employed in manufacturing. And as a consequence, these are kind of falling into the background. They're now suppressed under other economic sectors that have emerged to the fore and grown over the years. And that's in general. The map is now, rather than being green in rural areas predominantly, it's now pink. And I chose pink on purpose because most of the women who are employed, or most of the people employed in professional services, which relates to the pink colour, are female. The commerce sector, that light greeny blue colour that we see dominant around Dublin, but also Cork and Limerick and other places as well, really pops out. The commerce sector you can see dominant in particular areas, particularly for males. And then you look for manufacturing. Again, there's some areas of the country where manufacturing is incredibly important for males. But with regard to women, I mean, it really is professional services. That's what's coming to the fore. That's what is creating the job opportunities, and that's what's really important in terms of the current economic development of rural areas. So what's happening behind all of this? Well, there's a couple of things, and this picks up on some of the points that John was making earlier on. First and foremost, we see the changing relative significance of agriculture. Why is it changing? Well, this is a traditional analytical framework which views rural areas largely through an agricultural development lens. So that kind of rural development perspective is equated to agricultural development perspective. That's a very traditional perspective. It really emerged to the fore post-war. In 1946, it became really cemented in a lot of national policy documents. And it reflects one view of what rural development is about. But agriculture and farming in particular has been subject to huge changes, as was evident from some of the maps. And it is the most pervasive change that affects all rural areas in Ireland. It's the decline of the number of people who are employed in farming. And this decline is occurring because we're seeing consolidation in terms of farms, so declining farm, number of farms but increasing farm sizes. We're seeing greater specialisation amongst farmers, so focusing on the farm enterprise on one production system, and Janet mentioned some of the risks associated with that. We're seeing intensification of agricultural systems, so even though the number of farms are declining, the volume and value of output is increasing. And associated with all of these changes, we're seeing restructuring in the up and downstream industries associated, or enterprises associated with farming. So we can see that the food industry is also going through its own consolidation process. And those feed merchants and suppliers into farming and farmers, they're going through their process of consolidation as well. We've also got the growth of what is loosely termed here the new rural economy. So agriculture and things like traditional manufacturing was the traditional rural economy, well then the new rural economy is something slightly different. And this term relates to the development of particularly the services sector. So we see development of education, health, tourism, commerce and advanced services throughout rural areas. And these are increasingly important in terms of providing employment. It's very important, though, to realise that the jobs that are created in these sectors are quite specific. They require a specific set of skills or education or training. And it's not simply a case that someone losing a job in a traditional manufacturing industry can automatically get a job in one of these sectors. The growth of these sectors reflects structural shifts in the economy, basically. And we've seen that graphically demonstrated on the maps. And the maps also indicate that not all rural areas benefit equally. So what we have is many different types of rural economy that are undergoing simultaneous adjustments, but at different paces. Some areas that are close to towns and cities can do better in terms of attracting these industries and these sectors than those that are in more inaccessible places. Okay, but there are inaccessible or relatively inaccessible areas that are doing quite well based on the development of natural amenities. And we've seen very successful development of natural assets and the tourist industry associated with those in some rural areas, and frequently focused around small and medium-sized towns. So Killarney and Westport spring to mind here. The other thing that's ongoing is the increasing merging of urban and rural together. Okay, it's very difficult now to distinguish one from the other. And literally, if you go into your own households and think about that, you know, I mean, there's many people who have one partner working in an urban area, and maybe both partners working in an urban area, but living in a rural area. So it's actually quite difficult to disentangle. And improvements in road infrastructure combined with increased car ownership have led to this. Increasing commuting to urban areas by rural populations from work have contributed to it. And that sort of commuting reflects the transfer of income from urban to rural areas in terms of the wages that are brought back. It also reflects social changes in terms of greater female participation in the workforce. And I've talked a bit about that already. But complementing that, we also see increasing numbers of people from urban areas who want to live in rural areas. And they want to live in rural areas for a variety of reasons. In some instances, it's about access to affordable housing. In other instances, it's a desire for quality of life that rural areas offer. And these growing populations are really important because they lead to increased local consumption. Okay, and consumption of absolutely everything. So whether it's school places, whether it's doctors, whether it's the local shop or petrol station, so increased consumption all around. So there are rural areas that are benefiting from these developments. And this is a really important point, and it goes back to something Pat said earlier on. The way that rural areas are perceived, you get this impression that there's nothing good happening in rural areas, that all rural areas are in decline, that all rural areas are problematic. And the reality is that's not true. Okay? We have some rural areas that are doing okay, but we have some rural areas that aren't. Now, it's not to say that those rural areas that are doing okay don't have their own sets of challenges, but those challenges are different from the other rural areas. So we need to be very aware of these issues when we're discussing rural development and the types of measures that we need to put in place. Okay. Arguably, I think the most fundamental driver of change that is going to shape rural areas into the future is changing production processes. Okay, I'm going to get away from that sort of language now. And really what I'm talking about is how things are, where things are produced first and foremost, what is produced and how it's produced. Okay? So it doesn't matter whether it's milk or microchips. How those things are produced is changing dramatically. Okay? And it reflects a set of general forces that are at play, and a lot of people talk about globalization as a way of simplifying down what those forces are. And globalization it's facilitated by technical developments that enable production processes to be fragmented or broken up so that it can take place at different times in different places, or in fact simultaneously. So you've got different parts of a product being created in different places. So you've got that process that's ongoing at this point in time. And what that enables enterprises to do is to locate those different parts of the production process in those places that return the best return, or that return the greatest yield on their investment. And it leads to fairly rapid and fundamental changes in the structure of the rural economy. So the point is that we see production is increasingly stretched out over space. And if we think about something as simple as milk production in Ireland, we go back to the 1950s, there was the local co-op. The milk was brought to the local co-op. Then, tankers were introduced, and the local co-ops, became collection points, and then eventually they were shut down, and we see milk being shipped further to central processing plants, And we see the same thing ongoing all the time, that the scale is increasing and where milk is made and then where it's processed is increasingly stretched out. And the same thing is happening in the manufacturing sector, and it's happening in the services sector as well. So this gives rise to really advanced interconnections and interdependencies between places. It also exposes rural areas and urban areas as well, I suppose, but it exposes rural areas to rapid, fundamental, and sometimes locally uncontrolled change. So people feel powerless in the face of these changes to deal with. I've mentioned Scariff, and there was a chipboard plant in Scariff that was shut down, Finster, and the company that controls it was just literally shifting the machinery to another part of the world because, you know, the environment for producing chipboard in where that machinery was going was better. They could make more money out of it. It was much more efficient and effective for them. The community has no say in it. Yeah, it's very difficult for them to turn around and argue the case that, listen, we can be more competitive here. It can be very difficult to respond to these types of developments. But one of the fundamental points about globalization that people frequently miss is that globalization is filtered through two structural filters. The first one is the national regulatory framework. Now, in Ireland's case, we're part of the EU, so the EU can set the regulatory framework at that level. But it's not this all-pervasive and incredibly powerful force that overwhelms everything. People somewhere have to make choices about the type or flavour of globalization that we go with. Okay? So this is where the World Trade Organization comes in, and international trade agreements about who's allowed to do what. Is Brazilian beef allowed into Europe? And if so, what are the implications of that for Ireland? That's, they're the types of issues that determine what sort of changes get played out at a local level in Ireland. But there's also another structural filter, and it's the way that local areas react. And there are two responses generally to globalization, and this is the second last slide, I'm sure you'll be very happy to hear. Okay, so in terms of the responses to globalization in rural areas, there tends to be two dominant types. One is that of competitiveness, and it's that idea I mentioned in relation to the Finster Pact. Okay? And it's that idea of the capacity to respond. And it positions local communities as kind of a marginal actor, just at the edges of dealing with these changes. And it assumes that the local community has the capacity to adjust their capabilities in order to meet the changing economic and labour market requirements. So that could be anything from, listen, we're all willing to take a pay cut in order to keep the plant open. We're all willing to work longer hours. We're willing to reskill and retrain, do whatever it takes. Okay? So it's that idea that local communities have the responsibility to react and change. But there's another view, and it's one that in the public consultation process that we've engaged in, this is the one that really came to the fore, of local communities saying that they need the capacity to act. So that means local autonomy, supportive governance frameworks. So it isn't that they're just left to themselves, but that local areas have the capacity to identify issues and then to work on those issues. Community engagement, which suggests some sort of community leadership capacity, a strong local identity and clear conceptualization of their market position. What makes one area different from another? So in Scariff, what makes East Clare different from anywhere else? A positive attitude on the part of the community to change. Some of the issues coming back from the public consultation process spoke about this. Some areas felt that they had a really good positive attitude to change, and others felt no, that they didn't. It was a very traditional thing, that they didn't want to rock the boat. There needs to be investment in appropriate public goods and access to good education, health and other services. And that last one is particularly important because if you don't have those, people will be fairly slow to move to your area. You know? And that's a whole other issue. In terms of synopsising then what I've been trying to say and linking that in with the Cedra public consultation process, one of the principal things that I've identified is that there's no point just dealing with the results of processes that are producing uneven development. Okay, so there's no point in just looking at population change and going, oh, young people are leaving. Okay, that's the outcome of something else. Okay, so we need to find out, well, what is that something else? Why are they leaving? And how do we shape that? So in other words, there's no point in just being reactive to change. Local groups need the capacity to act and not react. There's a limit to what can be achieved at the local level. And this is really important. Okay? There is a limit to what can be achieved. And that's why the state has a vital role to play as you move away from the local level. And what I mean by that is that there could be a group, they want to try and do something, but you know, it involves the production of a certain, we'd say it's energy. You know, that feeds then into what's the access arrangement to the electricity supply network. That's never going to be shaped from a local level. That's always going to be shaped at a national level. And that'll determine what can and can't happen in areas. And that's where the state has a really important role to play. To provide comprehensive and coherent organisation that facilitates democratic decisions around the nature of development that meets the needs of people. And finally, associated with that, there is a critical need for a clear vision and appropriate strategy to back it up for different types of rural areas. And in terms of this, and this is literally the final point, this idea of openness in the queue, there isn't one pathway along which all rural areas are going to develop. You know, it's not a case of saying, oh well, at the moment such and such a place is behind. Behind suggests something, and I think it leads us to very poor decisions in terms of how we support those areas. They're different, they're not necessarily behind. And we need to be open to the idea that there are many different ways to develop. And that's very, very challenging from a policy point of view. So on that, I'll close. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, David. I'm sorry to be rushing you there a little bit at the end of such a meaty presentation. I can see the audience paying extremely close attention to both of the presentations. We have, however, drifted a little bit on our time schedule, but I'm sure we can allow 10 minutes or so for discussion, questions. So the floor is open. Perhaps I'd ask Pat to come back and join us here at the top table for the discussion and question session as well.
Okay, thank you, Geraldine. Damien O'Reilly is my name, ladies and gentlemen, and I work in RTE, and I feel partly responsible for Pat being in this job. I did an interview with him a few years ago, well, not that long ago actually, and he talked about driving from one part of West Kerry to another, and it took him an hour, and he left 2 cars on the road, and it kind of stimulated a debate in his mind about what is the future of rural Ireland and where is it going. So I'm sure it wasn't just that that brought him to the position that he's in. What we're going to do is we've run a little bit behind time. So as Pat said at the very beginning, this is not about you coming here and just listening to the speakers. It's about you, the stakeholders, giving your opinion. And rather than a question and answer session where you stand up and ask them questions based on their papers, maybe if you'd like to raise your hands, please, those of you that, there's a man up at the top there, for example, just state who you are, who you're representing, and just if you can be very brief, maybe your thoughts on what has happened so far, what you've heard this morning, and we will have similar post-session discussions throughout the day. So go ahead, please. Thank you.
John Flynn, Irish Cattle and Sheep Farmers Association. I would just like to address the question to Professor Janet on the alternatives and other practices within farming, because a study on farm alternatives have shown only 2% of alternatives have been taken up are successful as a source of income.
Okay, John, if you don't mind, I'll just take that as a point at the moment because we are running behind time, rather than as I said, a question and answer session. So, your point being, of course, that you disagree with the idea that there's a lot of scope outside the whole cattle production area on farms. Anyone else? I see Duncan here. Duncan, would you like to come in maybe with something? Can we get a microphone down here, because I know there was a lot of discussion there about the environment and the effects of sustainable intensification.
Thanks, Jamie. And first of all, I think all of the sessions and all we've heard so far is incredibly important and relevant to the future, and I'm really pleased that this conference is actually tackling these issues at this very bottom-up approach that Valley needed. But when I look at the issues in rural Ireland of, say, food and fuel, you know, 99, if I take any rural part of Ireland, any village, any town, less than 1% of the energy is produced in that local area, in that local catchment. And probably about 2% of food is local. Now there's two very basic issues where we look at it and we see, why is this, you know? I mean, 90% of our food is imported. Sorry, 90% of our energy is imported. And nearly 70% of our food is imported. So we look at that and we see all of that money that flows out of our local economy and the opportunities for value-added produce in all of these local economies, and how networking, which was very clearly mentioned here, how important networking is. There is an awful lot that can be done through networking and local collaboration and setting up small cooperatives. And it's just an area that I would love to see a focus on, because I think these are two very basic ingredients, and we heard there today about the problems of security of these issues and our over-reliance on imports and the problems of food scarcity. And we've got climate change, which is a massive issue that we can't ignore. It's going to be hugely critical to all of us. We're on a trajectory in this century of a +4 degrees rise in temperature. That's what the World Bank report has said. That's what the IMF and the OECD reports are saying. You know, we have to wake up to the fact that there's massive changes, and unless we respond to these changes and protect our ecosystem services at the same time, you know, I think there's huge, if you like, changes that need to come about in rural Ireland to if you like, take advantage of the opportunities that are there, and at the same time, you know, do it in this much more sustainable way, because we haven't been doing it in a very sustainable way. We've been damaging so much. So I'm just throwing it out as an issue. It's not a question really, but it's something I'd love to see this conference kind of taking up. Is just something, by the way, on that. I've been trying to get together a TV series in this whole subject, and I'm hoping to produce it. And I'm looking for examples at the ground in local communities, small green shoots in this area of local food, local produce, local energy, and that energy could be heat, transport, or power. You know, it's not just heating fuel. It's also retrofitting buildings. It's district heating going into small towns. It's biogas, anaerobic digestion. It's all of these areas that there's opportunities for enterprises in local Ireland. And I just look to see no more of this maybe coming into this conference today. So, thank you, Jim.
Okay, thank you, Duncan.
I wasn't getting ready to talk there, so sorry about that.
No, you're fine, you're fine. I just knew that you were writing furiously there when Janet was making a presentation here, because there's a lot of issues there that I know you feel strongly about. Yes?
Mr. Chairman, William Dunham, I say World Development Chairman. I'm just, you know, listening to Duncan there about why we can't produce more foodstuffs in this country. At the moment, I'm predominantly a dairy farmer. 40 years ago, I was a mixed farmer, where we produced vegetables, including potatoes, carrots, and what have you. But due to bureaucracy, red tape, and what have you, regulations from Brussels and everywhere else, we couldn't sell to the local shops. We couldn't sell to the local householders. We were basically forced out of business by bureaucracy and red tape. And the situation now, Duncan, is there are a generation of farmers out there and landowners who, because of what has happened in the past 25 and 30 years, are unwilling to take up new opportunities. Because when they produce the goods, the markets aren't there. We have the situation with the biomass and the willow pearl at the moment, and miscanthus. where when the farmers produce the goods, the facilities aren't there to manufacture the byproducts. And farmers are left, what are they going to do? Now, as regards statistics, I go back to 1984. We were producing milk, and we were getting 116 in pounds a gallon. That's equivalent to about roughly 150, give or take a cent or two today. At that time, that 1 gallon of milk would buy a gallon of diesel. It takes 3 gallons of milk today to buy the same gallon of diesel. The same is true for fertiliser. The same is true for meal. I think Ireland needs to wake up. The bureaucracy and the red tape and the pin pushers, you know, they need to be kept in Dublin or someplace else, but not definitely out on the farms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, at the back here, thank you. Go ahead, thank you, Willie.
Paddy Boylan, Farm Family Rights Group. Pat went round the country. The country's in crisis, and he only got 1,000 people to go to the meetings. Now they all needed a taxi, or they needed to be brought, or they needed to cop on. But have they lost the will? That's what I'd be worried about. You know, they'll go to Canada, they'll go all over the world, but they won't come down the road to a meeting. I see it all over. They'll have to get up off their arse and help themselves to a certain extent. But as well as that, the government has to help them. Because there's big cap payments coming out now, and they're all talk about filling up the greedy man's basket again, and giving nothing to the little man. Like, spread out around the country, it'd keep the country going, it'd keep employment.
Okay.
People wouldn't have to leave the land, wouldn't have to go and look for jobs, and leave the jobs for somebody else that needs them. 40 years ago, or 30 years ago, Jesus, I don't know how old I am, but I still feels young enough anyway. The bank manager told me to go and get a job after buying a farm. Bought the farm. I paid for it. But the principal thing was, I told him, I don't want to take a job from somebody else that needs it. Because I believe that if there's one job in each household, you have less crime, you have more involvement in the area. Because when there's a flag flying out of everyone's house with a job, there's at least something going in there. That someone in the morning has to get up. And we have isolated people. We've thrown them into where they're going to throw the rest of the farmers. And the IFA are behind this, let you believe. They don't want the small farmers of the country to get anything. Only pile the big pile into their big farms. The Cromwellian, some of them are put together by Cromwell, and they're still staying there, and they kept going by Cromwell. Now, we had another thing there, just when we're at it, the blight of Scariff. Them jobs well something else, but there's nothing in Scariff, so it's a blight area. It's just like the Spuds, or just like the fodder crisis. There wasn't very much about it because it was in a backward area. Sustainable development. It can happen. But just we need the will and the push. And hopefully that Pat will get more support from the people on the ground and the people at the top. But Pat, you have to open your mouth a bit louder for the smaller farmers round about the country that's on small payments and nearly no payments.
Okay. Thanks, Paddy, and I know that issue is going to be played out in Luxembourg in the next couple of weeks with regards to the new cap reform. Okay, is the man up here? Sorry, up here, yes. Thank you.
Mr. Martin McGillivray, so.
Microphone, yeah. Yes, Martin, go ahead.
Special Martin McGillivray, my name is Stuart board Cóú Forba Achilla Grunagal Charanda agus Marini Grissom Forbach Tuskert Grunagal. I concur. My name is Martin McBride. I'm the Board Director of Donegal Local Development Company and Secretary of North Donegal Community Network. I concur with Janet in relation to the bureaucracy issue. I see at our Donegal Local Development Company board meetings every month there is an audit from POBO, Department of Environment, Community and Local Government, umpteen audits regularly and often, and they go on maybe 3-6 months before they're complete, and that whole bureaucracy issue is causing people to postpone and not actually go forward with promoting projects. Another thing, and neither Donegal Local Development Company or North Donegal Community Network would be happy unless I mentioned it. We're putting in a submission, as Pat would have referred to the submissions, and a very central point in that submission will be the whole issue of a bottom-up approach in central to rural development. And the community sector, and I'm a community board director, would be quite unhappy with Minister Hogan's guidelines in relation to the implementation of the local and community development programme. And those guidelines, in one place is it said that it would be implemented via local authorities, and then the second point is that it would be using the best practice and a means that has been proven to be successful, and we would be saying exactly that local development companies are the proven have a proven track record in delivering the local and community development programme and the rural development programme. And the key message from our submission will be the retention of those programmes to be delivered and implemented by the local development companies in whom communities have trust.
Okay.
Agus run Jarna that was agam uncantch avi agam agus an mage a dirge pat spalam.
Okay, the photo was from Michael. Lady here, just can we take one more, Laura? I know we're up against time. We will have time. This man here, and just this lady, and then we'll have the coffee break. And if you can be as brief as possible, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Damien. Michael Ludlow from Mead Partnership, one of the local development companies, just commented on. But just to have a slightly different look at what we're at today's conference. I think what we've heard this morning is illuminating in one sense, and yet so much of it is what we know. Those of us who work on the ground, we know what you're saying, we know what Pat is saying, we know the message is well understood. And in terms of the rural communities, and I have one question at the end of this, in terms of the rural communities, they were the first people to react to the economic collapse. They were the first people to put their heads together collectively and start to raise funding to improve the quality of life in local areas and to support community enterprise. And once they had some interface with government through the LEADER programme, through the Department of the Environment, they did get going. And they are still working very, very hard. So there's a huge amount of positivity out there in that respect. But if we look at, let's say, things from a slightly different angle and we look at enterprise in rural areas, this is where we can see, and we honestly have to say, that the lending institutions are failing. Because chatting to a colleague from the IDA earlier on today, I was explaining where the four principal financial resources are coming from Damien. On the social side, we have Clan Credo and we have the Ulster Community Investment Trust operating through social funding. Then you now get into enterprise. You have local business people who see that another person's good idea is fundable, supportable, sustainable. And they are stepping forward and they are putting up the funding required to put that into place. We find friends from abroad who also recognise that such is the case with many really good propositions. And that's where funding is coming from. And also then the extended family, putting pension funds at risk and so on. Well, can I take back the at risk? There's nothing at risk in here. But this is where the drive is coming from. These are where the resources are coming from. But they are not coming from the banks. We have the ludicrous situation where a good business in Kells wanted to borrow €40,000 of bridging from the bank. They were told, well, if you invest or put back 40,000 with us, we'll let you have it. Now that may sound a sick joke, but it's commonplace today. So much of what, let's say, we have heard this morning, as I said, resonates very strongly with what we find on the ground. And as we move forward, let's say, these are the big issues that we give the community at large the tools, give the community at large the resources, and we should be proud of the programs that we have. And I've listened to the support for the bottom-up process. I know Geraldine Town is proud of the program. The Department of the Environment should be, and I'm sure it is.
Okay, Michael, thank you. Now, this lady here, do you mind if will you be here for the next session?
I will. I was just going to say with such increased female participation.
Yeah, exactly. Just very briefly, because we've got to go for just very, very briefly, quickly to this lady here, and then we've got to go for the coffee. We're running behind.
A really point. Deirdre Garvey from GMIT, the Mayo campus, and also for Council for the West. I was just interested in David Meredith's presentation. This is a very interesting trend in terms of we're seeing there in terms of employment sectors, but also participation. But in the employment sectors, one thing that I think is highlighted is that as our stage of economic development, and I'm wondering if David might comment on this, is that in the 70s it was highlighted by the Culliton report that we were very successful at attracting inward investment, but we needed to build our own industrial policy on enterprises. And so while we were attracting in the 70s and 80s in low cost, lower skilled labour, currently at higher cost of labour, knowledge economy, we're not attracted to that sector, and we won't retain that. And what we've seen in the recovery overall in the economy has been export-oriented and internationalisation of indigenous Irish companies. And there's a number of reports by the Western Development Commission in this, and the potential of a number of these sectors. I know the creative industries in particular, I know in energy, and I'm just wondering, is there any comment on that in terms of the internationalisation and export potential of those sectors?
Okay, Deirdre, David, do you mind holding that comment maybe for the moment? Deirdre, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you to all you for your statements and questions. We're running a wee bit behind time. Coffee has been served outside. I'll ask you to try and be back, or we'll have you back in here at about past, which means we're running about 15 minutes behind, which we could make up a little later on. So